Today we're going to take a brief look at the Great Depression, which was a global economic crisis beginning in 1929 and ending around the time of World War II, and really because of World War II. The Great Depression was a consequence of government policies in the 1920s in the United States. Easy credit, industry that depended on construction, on the building of automobiles and other durable goods. Durable goods are items that you don't replace very often. So both construction and durable goods meant that eventually the supply would exceed the demand. Easy credit meant that people would get in debt without the ability to pay it. There's other factors, but I want you to know that it was the government policies that really created the foundation for this great economic crisis in the United States. Both in the United States and in Mexico, we find unemployment, tremendous unemployment, underemployment. Underemployment is when you either work fewer hours than you want to or you're paid less than you would like. Wages decline, and then there's homelessness. When people are in social crisis or economic crisis, they generally try to find someone to blame. Something to blame. And during the Great Depression in the United States, one of the groups that was blamed for this crisis was Mexican immigrants. During the Depression in El Paso, especially starting in 1930, there was a movement among organized labor to stop immigrants from being employed. They didn't have a lot of control over private employers, but they did lobby the city government to pass an ordinance that the city would not hire Mexican immigrants, that the school district would not hire Mexican immigrants, and that the New Deal programs that I'll talk about in a second would not hire Mexican immigrants. This nationalism that grew during the Great Depression resulted in this idea of jobs for Americans only. The concept of American, though, didn't always have its roots in citizenship, so that Mexican Americans, US-born people of Mexican descent, could also be considered foreigners. The idea that the Great Depression, this economic crisis, was started because Mexican immigrants were taking jobs away from US citizens was not simply local. It was national. It was something promoted by the federal government. The president at the time was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was a believer in voluntarism. Companies could voluntarily hire more people, cut people's hours so they could hire more people. And he was heavily criticized during his administration for not directly intervening to help Americans who were suffering or to rebuild the economy. As Herbert Hoover is being criticized for not doing enough, his administration begins a campaign to blame Mexican immigrants. His Secretary of Labor, a man by the name of William Doak, begins a deportation campaign. This deportation campaign included raids on public parks, on other public spaces where Mexican and Mexican Americans would gather, and people would be swept up in these raids if they couldn't prove they were US citizens, which meant that many US citizens were taken in these raids and deported. Along with this, were some counties and some states who began repatriation programs. Repatriation means to return to your homeland. Places like California started state repatriation programs. Places like Chicago started county repatriation programs. And the assumption was that it would be cheaper to buy a train ticket and send a Mexican immigrant family to the border than it was to give them public assistance. So thousands of people are repatriated forcibly. As this campaign of scapegoating continues, the public becomes more and more angry, and Euro-Americans start to attack Mexican-American communities. There are some barrios that are burned to the ground. And as you can imagine, this creates tremendous fear among Mexican-Americans and among Mexican immigrants, who then start to repatriate themselves to escape the violence. Historians estimate that about 1 million people were either deported or repatriated during the Great Depression, and out of these 1 million people, more than half were US-born citizens. Many who tried to return to their homeland, to the United States, in the 1940s. In this cartoon, you see Uncle Sam saying, "You look like Mexicans." In the 1930 census, there was for the first time a category of Mexican. In those days, a census worker would come to your door and fill out a form. So the census workers were instructed to mark Mexican if the person looked like a Mexican. So what does a Mexican look like? We know that within Mexican-American families, we come in all shades, all colors, all phenotypes. So this is a time of scapegoating Mexican origin people. The Great Depression on the border is a fascinating time. It's a contradictory time. It's a time of tremendous change. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in a landslide election. People hated Hoover because they felt he hadn't done enough. So I think whoever ran against him would have been elected, but Roosevelt was elected. And Roosevelt had this idea that the government should intervene to help the economy get back on track. And importantly, that the government had a responsibility to actually help people. In the first 100 days of his administration, he created what was called the New Deal. And this idea of the New Deal came from his campaign, where he said he promised a New Deal for all Americans. The New Deal program, which was created by a body of legislation passed in those first 100 days, included regulation of banks. It included ways to control the economy. It included helping people directly with payments. It included ways to create jobs. And two of the programs I'm going to talk about that are here in Paso are the National Industrial Recovery Act and the Civilian Conservation Corps. Let me start with the National Industrial Recovery Act. This was a piece of legislation that asked industries to voluntarily create more jobs by, instead of hiring somebody for 40 hours, hire them for 30 hours, and that gives you the ability to hire more people. To voluntarily raise wages, which is a big thing. Wages got so low during the Depression that industries found it easier to hire people to do manual labor than to maintain machines that were doing it. So raising wages is an incredibly important thing. It also gave people the right to bargain collectively. In other words, to create unions, to negotiate with employers. So keep this in mind. The National Industrial Recovery Act created the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. In order to get Americans to buy into the NRA, there was a propaganda campaign. And there was a symbol of a blue eagle that was used. So businesses who supported the NRA would put this blue eagle in their windows, and then people were encouraged to go shop at those places. But it went beyond the logo of the blue eagle. There were NRA parades. There was one here in El Paso. There were NRA beauty pageants. And in El Paso, everything was segregated. So there was a Miss NRA beauty pageant and a Miss Mexican NRA beauty pageant. And they were even administered by different committees. There was the NRA committee and there was the Mexican section of the NRA. So here's one of the ironies. The New Deal is a federal program. It's administered by the states. So if a state has laws of segregation, if a state pays African American workers lower wages, for example, then that's reflected in the NRA. Then you get to the local level where it is really administered. And if you have a city that separates out Euro-Americans and Mexican Americans, like El Paso did, then you end up with a Miss NRA and a Miss Mexican NRA. So it's a federal program that in many ways reinforces separation. People in El Paso absolutely bought into the NRA and believed in it. And for Mexican Americans, they saw that part about collectively bargaining, right, creating unions, and they took it to heart. So two interesting things happened in 1933 as this goes into effect. One is that domestic workers in El Paso organize a union of domestic workers, of maids. And they begin to call their employers and say, we demand better wages, we demand better working conditions. In those days, you could hire a domestic worker for $5 a week to come in and work every day. There was an investigation conducted in 1935 by the state that found that some employers were hiring domestic workers for a bag of used clothing. So that is an occupation where people are really exploited. El Paso was known throughout the 20th century as the maid capital because of the availability of women to work in homes. And suddenly these women are saying to their employers, if you don't improve our working conditions, we are going to report you to the government. That is a huge shock. Now the women who are doing this are Mexican American, they're US born. The employers absolutely don't know what to do. That has never happened to them before. And when we talk about employers, we talk about the upper middle class and upper economic classes of El Paso. So they asked the government to deport the organizer, Charles Porras, who is a US born citizen. They tried to get the bridge closed so that it hurts Mexican women coming from Juarez to work. not realizing that it's not the Mexican women in Juarez who are organizing this. So you start to see a change in attitude. Mexican American women working in one of the most vulnerable jobs start to claim protection by the government. The Civilian Conservation Corps. If you've ever driven on Scenic Drive, you are benefiting from the work of the CCC during the Great Depression. If you ever went out to Ascarate Lake, you are benefiting from the work of the CCC. If you have ever sat on one of the older rock walls at UTEP, you are benefiting from the work of the CCC. The Civilian Conservation Corps hired young men in their teens and in their 20s to do these kind of improvement programs in cities and rural areas. And they would pay them directly, but they would also send part of their paycheck home to their families. So there is a lot of construction happening. There is a lot of improvement happening. Scenic Drive has been around for a very long time, but it was during this time that it was paved for the first time. So imagine driving Scenic Drive when it's a dirt road. Now the CCC, as it was administered here locally, was hesitant to hire Mexican American men. So you find programs that find ways not to hire U.S. citizens of Mexican descent. So both things are happening. Mexican Americans are claiming for the first time protection of they're claiming protection of the federal government, and they're also continuing to be excluded in many ways. So this is happening in El Paso. Some historians say that the population of El Paso has been at least 50% Mexican American for its entire history, with the exception of the decade of the 1890s, which is right after the railroads arrived. And there has been anti-immigrant sentiment and very often anti-immigrant action for that whole history in El Paso. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan came to town. The Ku Klux Klan, you probably know, started after the Civil War as a way to keep African Americans suppressed, not voting, not getting equal pay, not having freedom of movement. And by the 1880s, as segregation laws came into place in the South, the KKK was no longer necessary because instead state governments took their place to, quote unquote, keep African Americans in their place. So the KKK died out towards the end of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, the KKK started to come back to life. It was a slightly different KKK from the first one. The Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s continued to be anti-Black, but it also became anti-Jewish, anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican, and anti-Catholic. Instead of being concentrated in the South, it was concentrated in the Midwest. In the 1920s, the KKK used propaganda to say, we are the keepers of morality. If you've taken a U.S. history course, you know that the 1920s was a time of changing societal mores. So you had women out in public. You had the flappers with shorter dresses, with short hair, smoking. Prohibition was in place, yet there were many places to buy alcohol. The speakeasies were around, secret clubs. So the older generation felt that the younger generation was absolutely immoral, and the KKK took advantage of this to say, we, the KKK, are the keepers of morality. We want the U.S. to be moral like it used to be. We want women to know their place. We don't want all these immigrants around. It was very much a Protestant identified movement. It came to El Paso in the 1920s. By 1921, the Ku Klux Klan controlled the school board. Sorry, I have a fly bugging me right now. So by 1921, it controlled the school board. And here's how it came to power in El Paso. It came to power by being very anti-immigrant and very anti-Catholic. So when it controlled the school board, it had all Catholic employees fired, for example. And one of the things that the KKK did during their time controlling the school board was to name schools or to rename existing schools after who they considered the heroes of the Texas Revolution. So we have Bowie, we have Austin. My elementary school that had been founded in 1919 as Grandview Elementary was renamed Rusk Elementary. Rusk was a Secretary of War during the Republic of Texas, and he was very well known for killing Mexicans and killing Indians. So they're coming to power by appealing to Protestants and by appealing to Protestant churches to begin with. But they don't last very long. By 1923, they no longer have power in El Paso. And why is this? Because the Democratic Party needs the Mexican-American vote. Now, the Democratic Party starts in the South as the party of slave holders, as the party of segregation later in the 19th century, but it plays out differently here on the border. So the KKK is here for a little bit, but the names of schools reflect their presence here. So you have this history of anti-immigrant sentiment here in El Paso. In the 1930s, it gets stronger. You have men dressing up like immigration officials and arresting people on the streets and forcibly taking them across the bridge, whether they're U.S. citizens or not, as long as they look Mexican. So if you remember, not too long ago, the militia that was at Sunland Park, New Mexico, with guns and allegedly arresting asylum seekers, and their leader was charged. So these kinds of things have happened many times before in El Paso. What happens to Ciudad Juarez during the Great Depression? And you are doing a reading on Ciudad Juarez. One of the things that happens is the border traffic declines. One thing that people in El Paso do cross the border to do, however, is to buy groceries because they find it more affordable. The dollar stretches more if they buy groceries in Juarez. But tourism declines. People don't have the money to be tourists. So remember that in the 20s, Juarez was a full-on tourist town. But by the 30s, that mainstay of their economy dies because of the Great Depression. So the economy of Juarez declines drastically because of what's happening in El Paso. The Depression is a time of some strain between the two cities. And what we see over the 140, 50 years of the two cities existing simultaneously is that sometimes the relationship is really good, sometimes the relationship is strained. It's strained during the Depression. One of the reasons it's strained because of the anti-Mexican sentiment and activity in El Paso. It is strained because the U.S., or rather the El Paso government, is telling people not to cross to Juarez, and Juarez, meanwhile, is suffering economically. And there's always conflict about the bridge. You know, the bridges are not owned by the federal government. They're owned by the cities here in El Paso and Juarez. And in the 1930s, it was the cities that decided when the bridges were opened and when they were closed. So at a time when the city government in El Paso was trying to keep the bridge closed as long as possible on a daily basis so that Mexicans couldn't come here to work, Juarez, of course, wanted the bridge to be opened longer so that Mexicans could cross the border into El Paso and find work. Although the New Deal helped, and it definitely helped people by giving them jobs through various programs, the New Deal did not end the Great Depression. What ended the Great Depression was the coming of World War II in the late 1930s. Wars, unfortunately, are always good for economies because men, and now women, get jobs in the military. As the military grows, they need more things like uniforms, armaments, food, and that helps build up the production side of the economy. So it's actually World War II that ends the Depression, and we're going to look next at the effect of World War II on El Paso.